If you're joining us for the first time, we are a multiracial, multi-sector coalition of community and statewide organizations, advocates, community organizers, direct service providers, and an issue area experts working across multiple disciplines to advocate for holistic policies and programs that center the assets and needs of California's Black, Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Latinx young children and their families facing the greatest systemic challenges. Thank you. So whether you've been following reparations closely or just starting to engage with the topic, thank you for joining us today as we continue to think deeply about what real accountability and transformation could look like in our state and what it will take to achieve it. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a part 1 of this webinar series and had a discussion about the historical context of reparations in the United States and in California. That we talked about the 2023 California Reparations Task Force findings and its current context in California's legislative process. Today, we have the opportunity to continue the conversation with the members of the legislature to discuss the importance of including prenatal-to-3, the climate for reparations, discuss the importance of including prenatal-to-3, the climate of reparations in the state, and how community and advocates can get involved in the process as we look ahead to 2025. So first, we will, if we can move to the next slide, we can see a little bit of the agenda. So what we will be doing today is making, as you know, this webinar will be recorded. We have live transcription for those who need it. We will also have Q&A at the end. So please be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box so that we can make sure that we have them throughout the webinar for the end. And just to also remind everybody that the WCEP is an inclusive of all people and perspectives, except for hate. We do not tolerate malicious comments and will remove and report anyone who feels the need to disrupt the growth and peace of the space. Our objective is to hold a webinar where all people are safe and welcomed. And with that, I'd like to welcome Assemblymember Isaac Bryan. We today had planned to actually hear from both Assemblymember Bryan and Assemblymember Bonta. Unfortunately, she really wanted to be here today, but is unable to due to family circumstances, and we hope to have her again soon. So I'm really excited because to be able to have Isaac Bryan here, and hopefully we can pin him on the screen at some point so that you all can make sure you can see him. But just to give you a little about his background, he represents California's 55th Assembly District. He is the chair of the Assembly Elections Committee and Select Committee on Poverty and Inclusion. He's the treasurer of the California Legislative Black Caucus and vice chair and founding member of the Renters Caucus. I also believe he's on the Natural Resources chair. He authored key legislation to end prison gerrymandering, support foster youth, and remove financial barriers to family reunification, has worked to expand economic opportunities and protect communities from oil drilling, and expanding access to affordable housing. In 2022, he secured funding to expand the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies, the first of its kind at UCLA, as well as funds to establish the UCLA School of Law Center of Reproductive Health, Law, and Policy, and a statewide program creating educational stipends for previously incarcerated students. Thank you for joining us today, Isaac. Assemblymember Bryan, I shouldn't call you. Just be so familiar.
You can definitely call me Isaac.
I won't bore people. Well, first of all, I have not seen you in a minute, so I have to first say congratulations to you and Lamara for your nuptials, and just amazing. Really happy for you and the continuance of Black love and Black family. So thank you so much for sharing it with the rest of us in the world to be able to celebrate you both. So today, as we talked about, thank you for being here. This is, I think one of the really most important conversations that is happening in the state and across the country, as it should be. As reparations has been really a pivotal conversation in recent years, because we're talking about how do we address the systemic harm caused by chattel slavery, racial segregation, and economic exclusion. And as you know, we continue to argue that reparations is not only about the financial redress, but also about recognizing the enduring impact of all of those injustices and investing in a future that's really rooted in equity, repair, and reconciliation. So as we continue to engage in these discussions and talk about what meaningful reparation looks like, I'd really love to hear from you, like, why is reparations just personally important to you?
Yeah, no. Thank you, Shamika, and thank you everybody who's here. It's really good to be with you. It's personally important to me because it's that legacy of slavery, right? My family originates in the South. Part of the reason I ended up in the I was born in Texas, ended up in the child welfare system. My wife, Lamara, from North Carolina. I mean, these are the legacies by which our families come from. And you see that that legacy still permeates and resonates in life outcomes for descendants of people who were enslaved. Um, Disparate economic opportunities, increased likelihood of child welfare system involvement, decreased likelihood of graduating from high school and college, increased likelihood of touching the juvenile justice system or the broader criminal legal system, and of course, an impact on lifetime earnings. And so when we talk about all of these problems, we can talk about them individually, we can talk about them intersectionally, but we also have to talk about them at the root. And that's where reparations really digs in for me. It is personal as a Black American, but it's also personal as somebody who's living in this time where folks try to conveniently forget all this harm has been done, all of this harm has been created, and all of this harm continues to be maintained because we're not doing the needed, necessary work to redesign our systems of harm into systems of care and opportunity and provide proper redress for all those years of harm.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you and I share that history both from the South, but I've lived in Detroit, I've lived in major urban cities, and then to come west and also know, like, you know, the myths around, you know, reparations and slavery out in the West is very different than what you hear and learn in the East Coast and the South. And so I think that's really in part, we talked about this the last webinar, just understanding and knowing the history is a critical first piece for all of us, but most importantly for those who are seeking to align with our movements. So just thinking about a little bit before we get into more of the like specifics around, you know, how we are entering the conversation on reparations here as the whole child equity, just how, and the current task force recommendations, how are you thinking about them? How they are aligning with your priorities, and how do you see them playing into building a more just and equitable California?
You know, it's funny about kind of the recommendations more broadly because folks have been having a lot of conversations, particularly in the last 12 months. What is reparations, right? Is it policy that is derivative of those specific policy recommendations that came from the Reparations Task Force that spent 2 years gathering and compiling recommendations? Or is it just checks and direct cash transfers? And I think you find different splits based on folks who are engaged at different levels. For me, my lens to policy work has always been a repair lens, like reparations work and thinking about how we redirect public resources to address historic harm specifically for Black Americans is why I ran for office. Prior to the reparations report even coming out, we were already passing this kind of work. So in the child welfare space, I saw one of the recommendations had to do with child support. And I know a lot of folks hear different things when they hear child support, but many don't realize that when parents lost custody of their children to the child welfare system, going back to the 80s, counties were putting child support arrears on those parents, essentially asking them to pay for a portion of their child's care, foster care. And we know that you don't lose custody of your children because you have excess resources, especially economic resources. And so prior to this report even coming out, we were already looking at how do we clear that debt? How do we let families continue to build economic opportunity and mobility? How do we stop punishing poor parents for losing custody of their children? It is punishment on top of punishment, harm on top of harm. We helped clear over 400 million in back debt that was held. And going forward, California will not charge parents for their children's time in foster care because of work we were doing prior to this report. And so for me, this has always been the perspective I've had to policy work, but having these recommendations clearly spelled out, the history, the legacy, the reason why they are important, I think it continues to give a guidepost, not just for me and members of the Black Caucus, but for anyone who wants to meaningfully engage in this kind of work.
Yeah, I really appreciate you just talking about the guideposts of like, and the work that was already happening on the ground. And then really this is just the blueprint of how to make sure that we're all aligned in what we need to be asking, pushing for going forward. So let's talk a little bit about the budget, because we know this past year budget cycle was very challenging.
Yeah.
With a $55 billion shortfall, we had some tough decisions to really protect critical safety net programs for children and families. And we very much appreciate you standing with us very early on and saying that we are not going to balance the budget on the backs of poor people.
Sure.
But looking forward toward the next legislative session, what does sort of the evolving budget and policy landscape mean for advancing reparations? And what I mean by that is it's sort of like, what are the challenges and opportunities do you anticipate, considering, we already know kind of what the budget outlook is looking like, and, despite some successful efforts in this, these competing priorities.
No, that's exactly right now. And I think we can't separate the policy and budget landscape from the political landscape, quite frankly. So this year, at the top of this year, we were told historic budget deficit, first time in about a decade. Many of my colleagues had never seen a budget deficit. I hadn't seen a budget deficit in my 3 years in Sacramento. We've got to go to the drawing board, go back to the table and see what programs we can take from. Now, my orientation initially and immediately was we spend way too much money on our systems of harm and on our state prisons. So if we're going to take any money from children and families, we better be looking directly at these systems of harm first. And there was some pushback initially. And then the Democratic caucus in the state assembly actually put out a survey. Would you like to see us cut prison spending or money from the prisons or close more prisons? And believe it or not, more than 50% of my colleagues said yes. They weren't sure how, they weren't sure kind of what amount or what exactly which way to do it, but said that we have to look this direction. And that's important because we cut nearly $1 billion in expected prison spending, either through vacancies, either restoring different components and taking away from places where we had excess and bloat. And that was critical for saving key programs, for making sure CalFresh remained relatively constant, for making sure the FERS program for foster youth continued to have funding, to really make sure we didn't balance this budget off the back of poor people. And the reason I said initially we can't devoid the budget and the policies from the broader politics is because we're also facing a tough on crime backlash like the 90s. We are looking at a major regression in the way we talk about, think about, and implement criminal justice policy. And if that continues to take root, especially at a federal level, we're not immune from that. And that survey that showed over 50% last year can shift immediately and very fast. I mean, there are things on the ballot right now that we will have to pay for if the voters pass them. And the only way to pay for some of those things during a budget deficit is to pull back from this reparations work, to pull back from redress and restoration and preserving the opportunity that we've been investing in for years. I'm hell-bent on fighting that no matter what. I think in the state that has over $300 billion in annual budget and the world's 5th largest economy, in California, we can't afford to go back. That's not just a federal slogan. We're not going back. I refuse to go back. And hopefully my colleagues will feel the same way, because I think when we invest in children and families, when we fight to repair the harms that have been caused through neglect and divestment of the past, that's how we chart a path towards the future. The only way we chart a path towards the future.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I think that just forward together and no going back, that is the part that does give me some hope. I'm understanding that when we do stand in solidarity together, we can win. And we did win a lot this year. Not everything that we all wanted to win, but there were some really critical pieces that would have had devastating consequences, particularly, as you said, for foster youth and children, families of children. So I do think that's what keeps me going too. So I hope that is keeping you fortified. So just thinking about, as I said, how we come to the conversation around our youngest, not most precious, but most vulnerable at some stage in our lives, children. We explored in the last webinar, the 15 policy recommendations. We didn't go through them all, but we talked about them. And how, while the report itself talks about the harms that have affected Black infant maternal health, children's health and well-being, the recommendations don't explicitly actually address the critical sort of prenatal, the 3-stage development, which we all know is really foundational to lifelong outcomes. And that doesn't mean that it's not important. It's just not something that's called out in that same way. And so I think as we move forward, we really want to make sure that you, as we know you do, but like your colleagues and others are understand why it's important to be explicit about prenatal to 3 in reparations recommendation policies, not necessarily in the report, but the policies that move forward. Like, how are we focusing on this stage of support? Because we know what it means for the health and equity and reparative goals for future generations, right? So when we think about where these babies will be in the next 20, 30 years, like, how are we making sure we're looking out for them? So just as a entry point, like, where do you see prenatal to 3 fitting in this policy landscape that moves forward?
I think it has to have an explicit and called out place, starting with, prenatal care and infant mortality rates. I mean, do you see these terrible outcomes for Black mothers and Black children and Black families that continue all the way from the onset of pregnancy until the life expectancy of the child? We have to start at the beginning. We have to start at the root. Every investment we make in that early stage of childhood development and of childhood life is an investment that pays back several times over the course of their life. I'm glad that we've made the investments in transitional kindergarten. I know we've got some tweaks that we've got to get right. I know Assemblymember Bonta has been 10 toes down in that fight with her experience and her history, and even legislatively. Recently, there's more that we've got to do, and I think it's a focus that I'm glad that you all uplift and continue to remind us, because when a budget deficit hits, it's scramble mode. Everybody goes and they go into their silos. I care about this. I want to protect this. I care less about that. We can afford to let that go. And it's children who are in those early childhood development stages that don't have their own voice in politics, who are not old enough, not conscious enough to advocate or organize or fight for themselves. They need us. And you have me in this fight, but I'm grateful that they have you, because it's coalitions like this that really give voice to the voiceless. And that's a voice that's got to be heard in Sacramento, especially in the tough times.
Yeah. So one of the things that I often think about, and you're not there yet, but you have lots of friends with young children, I'm sure, is that it's the most, economically probably stressful and difficult times in the life cycle of raising children, right? And especially for Black families who are, or parents, I should say, who are facing all the systemic inequities that we already talked about, like the lack of investments, is critical more than ever. So like, whether we're talking about paid family leave to childcare subsidies, part of all of that leads back to the economic underpinning to make your household run successfully, right? And so one of the things that I'm curious to have your thoughts on is sort of what policies, sort of economically based policies, do you really see as helping chart the course to change, or I should say, really address and repair some of the economic harms for young families when we think about reparations? So in the context of the economic security that is needed, what investments could we be making that we aren't making, or should we be doubling down on in the state?
I mean, talk about universal basic incomes, right? You talk about cash transfers and direct and tangible investments in communities. UBI is a part of that. And new emerging and developing families, young families, deserve that kind of investment. Pregnant mothers and deserve that kind of investment. The reason I don't have any children yet is in no small part because of that economic weight. But it also shows a certain level of economic privilege to be able to choose for ourselves, right? My wife and I, that this is not the right time. I remember growing up, we went to the WIC office. We had CalFresh. We had the things that we needed. I also remember that, I have 12 brothers and sisters. We were our own child care unit. If you were 3 years older than somebody else, you were their babysitter. You were their caregiver. You were responsible. And that's just a weight that can't quite be carried across the community, and definitely shouldn't have to be carried across the community. There's a need for public intervention. There's a need for public investment. And I think part of that investment can go to direct dollars for young families. I think that's something also that's by and large understood and popular. We've got to invest in young families it's strange to think that there should be some sort of bipartisan support for this, as much as some of my colleagues across the aisle would talk about the family unit, but then seem to neglect the needs of young children and new families economically. That's not lost on me, but I'm also welcome to any recommendations and suggestions. As was mentioned, the reparations report, it lays out some policy recommendations, but more than anything, it's kind of a historical document. Some of the recommendations are very vague. It's just kind of like, hey, look at this, or fix this, invest in this. And legislation has a degree of specificity that's greater than that. And so I would love to partner with you and work with you to see how we can restructure these systems and make sure that we make the kind of economic investments that help families during this difficult time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I mean, it's an incredible document in terms of just the depth and the, we talked about this the last time in encouraging folks to read it. If you don't have a chance to read it, go watch the YouTube videos where they went through it, because it is so important, as a historical document, but as just a, incredible framework for people, all of us really, because we all don't know, we don't know, to like look at how we can address these systems, which when you talk about them, they seem like they cannot be addressed, like they seem intractable. Like that's why people are like the abolition movement, because we haven't figured out how do we imagine something different. And I think that the task force report is really help pushing us to say, no, we can change these institutions and these structures, and they must be changed if we're going to actually repair all the harm that has been done to Black American or African Americans. So, so I hear you in terms of like, yes, the specificity I don't think has to be there, but we have to adopt and hold on to the truths of the framework that is trying to push forward, right?
Exactly right.
Just to sort of name a little bit about what we are doing in the state. I think, as you know, we've been very proud to actually have a state with a young child tax credit, right? So we have refundable tax credits, the Cal EITC, and every year it's putting $1.3 billion back into the hands of low-income families, including, most importantly, disproportionately Black and Latinx families. 3.5 million families a year. And that doesn't happen without the continued investment of the state. So that is a really important piece when you talk about what is that cash transfer? What can it look like? It can look like the UBI pilots that the state has invested in and continuing to expand them. But the very most important critical program around, tax credit investments. Childcare, we know that was it continues to be a dogged fight. As you said, Assemblymember Bonta's not here to sort of share that part of the story, but we want to continue to make sure that those slates and the single rate reform continues so that we aren't, continuing to regress back where, people who are caring for our youngest, most precious children are not even making a living wage, right? So I think those are the pieces that, we would continue to lift up. There was a diaper policy bill this year, making sure that medically necessary diapers could be gotten through Medi-Cal. Continuous Medi-Cal coverage, I didn't even talk about that. Like, that's a really important piece to make sure that when women are on Medi-Cal and they have their babies, they can continuously stay enrolled, and those babies, as many doctor's appointments as they have to go to, don't fall off the rolls. So there's some really important policies that I think people in our coalition and others continue to work on that touch on the underpinning purpose of what we're trying to achieve. And that's to make sure that families have, the ability to take care of their babies and help them grow and be successful here in California. And if, like you said, there's no excuse for why that should not be the case, given where we sit as an economy. And the people that we have elected to help us do that. So I appreciate
I do want to lift up, though, that doesn't happen without you all. Your advocacy, your engagement, your willingness to get in and fight the hard resource fights, because that's the unseen fight. There's a lot of policy fights that are high profile. They draw a lot of press. The budget fights are where the real resource allocation happens. Thank y'all for being in the trenches and in the weeds. We need you. And next year, we've got to go back and fight for what our families deserve.
Yeah. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about something that I'm curious to hear what you're thinking about. So the governor did sign AB 3889, and it marks a pivotal moment as it affirms California's recognition of the harms caused by chattel slavery and issues a formal apology. While apologies alone are insufficient, to deliver justice or fully redress the wrongs endured, they can serve as powerful steps, right, towards that communal reckoning. So I'm just curious, like, why do you think we're not talking about this as much? What do you think it means for the state to have this symbolic act of an apology? Obviously, the material forms of reparations are really, really important, but I'm just curious what you think.
I think it's fantastic. I think it's funny though. I know a lot of folks who believe everything there is to have gotten and that we deserve and that we should have gotten needed to happen this year.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of ridiculous. Not just because we've already waited several hundred years. That's not why, but because you have to build momentum. You have to build a foundation to grow from, and you have to normalize these conversations that prior to 2 years ago would have been completely taboo politically. We have a governor who has decided to sign this apology and call for this apology. So when we send a robust and thoughtful and inclusive and engaged package of reparation bills next year, he will be in a very difficult place in terms of trying to walk back on them. This is progress. It is important. And it's something we build on. We don't sit and lick our wounds or talk about losses or ideas of what should have been or could have been. We go make that the reality. And I expect to be in office in January if the voters will have me in a few weeks. I expect to be doing this work for a number of years. I've been doing this kind of work my entire life in terms of trying to shift resources directly towards communities who have been most harmed. I'm grateful that there's a willingness in Sacramento to even entertain this conversation. And now it's on those of us who are leaders in the Black Caucus and the Black Caucus more broadly to channel that willingness into the kind of action and direction that lays a pathway for the rest of the country.
Yeah. Yeah, I really see it as you were saying, you know, we can be disappointed in how we haven't gotten everything that we would like to see. But, it's not lost on me that not every state in this country has issued an apology, right? And how important that is to begin that just the repair can't start without atonement, right? By all acknowledge, and when you read the apology, and it does talk about the structural inequities that have been imposed upon African Americans or Black Americans in California, but just understanding that we're going to put this up in the Capitol so that when people come to visit, like when families come and we walk them across to see the big bear in the horseshoe, I want them to see this too, right? Like I want this to be just as prominent as that bear, and that the kids who come through those hallways understand California's role in chattel slavery and its work to repair that. Yeah.
Shamika, it's even bigger than that because people think this was like easy. Uh,
Mm.
the narrative that California was a free state and California didn't participate in slavery, that was something we fought all year. And the Reparations Task Force report was critical to that because it laid down California's history, participation, either actively or passively in allowing these institutions to continue and permeate through our state. So this apology acknowledges that, something that both Democrats and Republicans were previously saying did not exist here. California has nothing to apologize for. California has nothing to atone for. The fact that we've pushed back, gotten rid of that, and in permanency acknowledged that kind of harm to such a degree that it requires a public and permanent apology, that's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your work and everyone else's work on that. I can't wait to take my children to see it. So, talking about blind spots, I guess we should say, or understanding acknowledgments. According to the recent findings from the American Association of Medical Colleges Center on Health Justice, support for reparations has grown to just under 50% among non-Black individuals. However, resistance remains in certain communities. And at the same time, when you ask them, poll these same people around the policies recommended by the Reparations Task Force report, they get bipartisan support. So with over 70% of California's support across political lines backing policies for environmental justice, student resources, rent control. So what would you say to those Californians who still oppose reparations, given the widespread support for the related policy recommendations?
Yeah, I think when you lift from the bottom, we all rise, which is something you and I both heard in a select committee on poverty and economic inclusion a year and a half ago, and it's stayed with me ever since because I truly believe that. And when you look at folks who have been harmed by past policy frameworks, divestment, or direct, direct and intentional state sanctioned harm, and you look to repair that, it protects everybody and it creates opportunity pathways for everybody. The reason the policy frameworks of the Reparations Task Force are bipartisanly popular is because everybody believes every community should have all of these things. So
Mhm.
targeting these kinds of interventions in the places that don't have them, right? In Black American communities, I think that's where you get the pushback, and I think it brings to light the undergirth of racism, anti-Black racism that still exists in the conversation. Everything is good until it's Black.
Right.
And that's something we have to continue to push back on. I
Yeah.
think California is poised to lead in that way. I know that my district, as diverse as it is, we share a common belief and a goal in an inclusive California that acknowledges and works to repair harm. We've got to just keep building on this progress. We've got to keep pushing because if we can continue to make progress here, if we can continue to lead by example, it will have a ripple effect across the entire country. We've just got to stay focused, um,
Mhm.
continue to strategize, and stay together.
Yeah. Well, I hope people are putting questions in the chat because we're all close to our time of the things that I was really on my mind. So if you haven't yet, please do use the Q&A function. Um, I think in terms of just how do we keep this momentum and like leverage what you just said, the relationships, the understanding, getting more and more people to, join in the education that it requires to understand the history of slavery in California is like step one, right? And we're doing so much more than that. We're beyond that. Thank God to all the advocates in the task force report work, and the coalitions that have emerged or continue to do that work. But so much of it often feels like it's directly relational, right? It's like talking to your neighbors and talking to people who don't ordinarily come into these conversations. It's like here, we're hoping that folks who are, you know, serving young children like see this as an issue that's vital to them, right? It's not just about how do we make sure we have childcare slots, but how do we make sure that we are serving our Black babies just as well and with the fullness of what they deserve, and supporting what is needed for them to have that through this work. And so much of that, I think, continues to be just the work that we all have to do in our individual lives. So thank you for sharing that. Um, I think there is a question and I'm gonna see if I can see it here. And okay, before I go to my last question. So here's one. Thank you for everything you and the CLBC have done. We won the Bruce's Beach fight, but we still fighting the descent. Oh yes, for the fighting with the descendants in Palm Springs and Section 14
Section
fight.
14.
How do we make people aware of that? Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question, whoever put this in here, because I often am telling people, do you know about Section 14?
Yeah.
And it's another place in which we should be really lifting this up. So, but I'm gonna turn it over to you so, to talk about this.
No, I'm fully aware of Section 14. Ariva Martin is a good friend. In fact, some of the survivors and descendants of Section 14 came up to my district to do a press conference just last year. I know that the city council in Palm Springs has continued to advance those conversations, but we need to have a broader conversation about the eminent domain and the stripping of Black land and resources. And I know there was some legislation this year around that, but actually I was told that it wouldn't have helped Section 14 survivors. And so we've got to make sure that we're not just talking about what the solutions could be, but working directly with the survivors that we're trying to help restore land, restore resources, or restore some kind of equity. Bruce's Beach was a great example. Allensworth is another example. We've got to get Section 14 right, but there are also many folks who cannot even organize for this kind of conversation because we've absolutely destroyed communities with the way we built freeways and other civic infrastructures. And so there's a true atonement that's got to be had. I'm grateful to the survivors of Section 14, the descendants of Section 14, Ariva Martin and others who are organized. And I personally am in constant conversation with that coalition about where the state can play a role in making sure that the city of Palm Springs steps up, or that we all collectively bear the weight and responsibility of those actions?
Well, thank you so much. And hopefully, I can't go pull it because I'm in the webinar, but somebody will pull it for folks because there is a website to go and learn more about Section 14 and how you can be supportive of the work of the survivors. It's really important. We have one more question. Reparations now is a must. How can or is the reparations movement connecting with the land back movements to uplift not only bipartisan, but cross-cultural organizing and activism?
So would love to know more about what the land back movements, what that means. When I hear that, I think of like community land trusts and cooperative ownership in Black communities, which is something we've been working at. In my district, we have a number of Black community land trusts that are kind of buying property throughout the neighborhood to make sure that it stays ours, especially in the wake of displacement and gentrification, and the kind of erasure of historic Black communities that have been built and made prominent through our presence. And so those movements to me are linked. I think all of these things are intersectional in terms of the policy harms that have been done to us and the solutions, and they're all Black. So the biggest thing we can do is stay in solidarity, stay in conversation, recognize that there is no redress without Black leaders and Black representation in the state legislature. We've got to support our elected leaders, but we've also got to move a deep solidarity with community and experts and folks with lived experience like the survivors in Section 14, with scholars and others who have helped produce the body of work that's led to this critical moment. There's too much at stake for us to divide amongst ourselves or for other folks to come in and try to divide us. This is the moment for the deepest coalition solidarity we've ever had. But I think if we show that, if we demonstrate that, not only can we get land back, but we can chart a pathway towards the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what they're referencing. And that makes sense and actually leads into another question that we got, which is how do we bring in the other diversity caucuses and have them similarly prioritize this repair, and especially given the intersectionality of our issues, which I think is what you were getting at. But do you have anything more specific on the other caucuses?
Well, I think what's beautiful is the API caucus and the API community more broadly, because of the Japanese internment camps that took place here and across this country, understand harm and redress. The Jewish caucus and my Jewish colleagues, because of the Holocaust, because of the harm, the repair and the redress experience there historically, there's a natural synergy. One of the things that I see happening often that is incredibly divisive and harmful is pretending like the movement for reparations can only happen if we disparage and discard our undocumented communities. That is causing major damage and fractions and friction between natural allies, both in the fight for opportunity, but in the fight for redress. Here in California, there's nobody more proximate to the Black struggle than Latinx communities who share our neighborhoods, who share our culture, who share kind of a similar contemporary experience in that country, and educating them on how the historic relationship is drastically different. That enslavement and the legacy thereof is drastically different. I know we can build allies, and we need those allies to get things done. So these fractures that are rising, the idea that looking out for somebody means you're not looking out for yourself, or they won't look out for you if you look out for them. All of that kind of divisiveness is not going to be helpful to our long-term goal. This is a solidarity moment. It's an education moment. It's a bring more people into the fold moment. And there's going to be nothing more powerful than when all of the diversity caucuses of the state legislature are standing and supporting the same kind of repair for Black Americans in California. That is the moment I see in the future. That's the moment I'm working towards. And that's the moment where we know we're going to get what we deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a zero sum. And I think we have to continue to push back on that narrative. Oh, okay. So real quick, the question was actually referring to Native American indigenous efforts across America to enforce treaties and regain ancestral homelands.
No, I think there's a lot we can learn from the success of those movements. I also think we have to be honest and acknowledge, similar to the last point I was making, that work hasn't been done successfully and in full. There are many indigenous communities and tribes across California, California's First Peoples, that do not have their land back, that do not have recognition federally or statewide, that have been broken and displaced, that have a portion of their historic lands because there's no way the state is giving them the rest of it. I mean, that's a fight that I think we also have to engage with in solidarity. It's foolish for us to say, look at Section 14, look at Allensworth, look at Bruce's Beach, look at the way the freeways split South LA all the way into the IE, and then leave our indigenous brothers and sisters standing by themselves in their calls for redress and atonement. As I said before, I truly believe that there is no way we accomplish this goal, Black folks alone. That being said, Black folks, we have to stick together, and solidarity and coalition building is how we're going to get this done. That's what I'm working towards. And I think if we all work towards that goal, we'll be successful sooner than anybody could have imagined. Certainly our ancestors.
Yes, I know. I think that oftentimes we get, I remember coming up and, my mentors would be like, the struggle continues. And I'm like, why do they say that over and over and over again? Because it does. And yet we can look back and see how far we've come, but it's only because we've continued to struggle together. And so I think so much of that really resonates with me. So we do have one more, I'll probably ask one more question, and then I'm gonna ask the final question. And this one is from Black ECE and says, they have been unapologetically in our work with Black families, early educators, and Black families, has been unapologetic in our work. As we know, enslaved Black women were the OGs in caregiving. So how do we ensure that this point, if recognized, respected, is recognized, respected, and taken into account in the reparations conversations?
First of all, you have my full respect, and not just the OGs, the current caregivers, whole community caregivers. I mean, I'm not here without my grandmothers and my aunties and my big sisters, my chosen family and kinfolk across community, of which I include Shamika being a part of that. That is the legacy that we've built on, and I think you cannot have redress or proper acknowledgement of harm and repair for that harm without being honest and true to that experience. I think also I can't wait for this election cycle to be over, because I'm so tired of folks trying to act like Black women and Black men are not on the same page. Like we don't fight together, like we haven't always fought together. Like this isn't our shared struggle and our shared fight. We know the role that Black women play in our community and have historically, whether they were forced to or just stepped up when there was a vacancy. And we know the systems of harm that are directed with an acute sense of direction towards Black men. And we know that dismantling those and acknowledging and uplifting those are something we share and do together. And so I see you for my sisters. I see you for my mothers and grandmothers and aunties doing this work. And I won't do any reparations work or have any conversations about the pathologizing of Black families that doesn't acknowledge that role that Black women have played, not just in our families, but in all families.
Thank you. Okay, my final question is, what opportunities and ways can community, and you've already lifted us up a little bit, but community members and advocates really get involved in the policy process for reparations policies?
Yeah, I think the Black Caucus, we are, already beginning conversations about next year, about how we continue to advance the work forward, how we build on the progress and continue to take the direction with even more intensity. Every year, we've got to continue to gain momentum and leverage that momentum. Also recognizing the governor is on a 2-year clock now, and so in my mind, we should get the very best he's got.
That's right. I tell him, I send messages. Stop talking about expirations date. You got a lot to do between now and the end of the next 2020.
We got to get the very best that my man's got before he leaves, right? And so that's our goal. That's what we're going to do. But we need partners on the ground. We need partners shaping policy. We need partners coming to committee to talk and be heard. We need partners shaping the budget. We need partners watching our back, and we need partners looking for the blind spots, right? The budget is there is a lot going on in Sacramento always. Sometimes we don't know. I don't know that something is an issue until somebody raises it for me. I'll give you an example. Last year, when the first round of budget suggested cuts came in the May revise, actually, it cut third day visitations on level 4 yards. It means families
No.
couldn't visit their relatives in places like Pelican Bay, which are in the middle of nowhere. And the third day visitation was Fridays, right? And so you'd have to have gone during the regular week. It also impacted me directly because I have a sibling who's incarcerated in Pelican Bay, and I'm in session Monday through Thursday. But I actually didn't even know this happened until community came and let me know, hey, they just took third day visitations, because I'm busy processing all of the other large systemic changes that are being proposed. I might miss a blind spot like that. So your advocacy, your work, your eyes help us stay focused. By the way, we restored those third day visitations by the time the final budget was put together and signed. But that doesn't happen without a concerned, activated, thoughtful community. We have to build together, and I'm looking forward to building together with you all, not just in this year to come, but in the many years until this work is done.
Well, we're so grateful that you are there, that you're with us, that you continue to take the hard questions, the hard conversations, that you roll up your sleeves, and that you're doing the good work that we send you there to do, my brother. So we really appreciate you. And I think as we move forward, we're going to close out this webinar. So thank you to everybody who tuned in and is listening. There will be a follow-up email where we're going to grab those resources to let you know about Section 14, the YouTube videos on the Reparations Task Force report, and a few other things as follow-ups. We do have an evaluation, I think, that's going to pull up. I think it's on the next slide, of the resources. And what's really, really important is making sure you get out there and vote so that we can have informed leaders who stand in solidarity with community, that listen to community, that come from community, that understand the impact. So when you say third day visitation, like, we actually know what that means deeply. And I appreciate you don't have to always share your personal stories, but you do, because you know they resonate deeply from within and the community, for all of us, and what that means to not be able to have the weekend to get somewhere, or take your kids out of school, or all those things. And it just gets back to where we started our conversation, all of the inequities and the harms that have come from slavery that we're trying to repair in this state. And so just thank you for your continued leadership, your friendship, and the work that you do. So.
Well, thank you all. Thank y'all for having me.
And that will conclude our webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope you'll take a few minutes to fill out this evaluation.